We're thinking primarily here of the challenges of digital sovereignty and data localization. And I actually like that term, digital sovereignty. I don't think it has a formal definition. But that first part, digital, really has you focus more than on just the data, right? But it's the whole stack. What does it take to have digital capabilities in today's world, especially with AI? So when we're talking about digital sovereignty, let's think about the whole stack. And when we're thinking of sovereignty, what we're thinking of, at least what I think of, is the government's ability to exercise power in two ways. One is sort of the mandatory power, the restrictive power, the prohibition power, pass laws and compel people to do what you want them to do because that is the sovereign authority of the government. And a corollary to that is the obligation to protect and defend and to enhance national security. And then there's the softer forms of power. There are incentives, encouragement, trying to get people to cooperate with you, and trying to get companies to invest in your country and in your infrastructure. So sovereignty, think of as this both coercive and then the more persuasive forms of power. And we're looking at the entire AI stack. And I think what the AI stack does is that it broadens the surface, broadens the area that government can act on to compel and to protect and to encourage. All right, without further ado, let me introduce our terrific panelists here. At the very far end is Alice Friend. Alice, Dr. Friend is the global head. I called you doctor. Are you?
I am a doctor.
You are a doctor. Yes,
Yeah,
there you go.
right.
Sorry, my
Don't act so surprised.
No, I thought I was just getting it mixed up. Yes. You are the acting head of AI and emerging tech policy at Google, where you lead a team that helps company advise policymakers on constructive approaches to technology innovation. Before joining Google, Dr. Friend spent almost 20 years in the national security community in DC, working at the Pentagon and at some of the leading think tanks in the country. Next to her is Ambassador Karen Kornbluh. Karen was, until recently, the Deputy Director of the White House Office on Science and Technology, and she directed the National AI Office. Previous to that, she served as U.S. Ambassador to the OECD, and she is currently a visiting fellow at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Next to her is Ken Propp. He is the Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's think tank, specializing in transatlantic digital policy, and he teaches European Union law at Georgetown Law School. So we will be asking Ken about the European Union. He served for many years in the U.S. Department of State, including as legal counselor to the U.S. mission to the European Union in Brussels, which is where you and I met, as I recall. And then we have Shane Tews. Shane is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a proud alumni of American University. At AEI, she focuses on digital economy issues, including AI, cybersecurity, and emerging technologies. Previously, she was vice president of global policy at VeriSign, and early in her career held positions in the White House and on the Hill. And as for me, I'm currently with the Tech Law and Security Program at American University, and before that, I was the Civil Liberties Protection Officer for the Director of National Intelligence for a bunch of years. So let me start with a question for all of you. We've been hearing, briefly mentioned these trends around the world toward digital sovereignty, data localization, concerns around governments trying to make sure they have some control over their digital destinies, in particular AI. Let me just go down and ask you, what are your general thoughts on that? Is it okay for us to have silos for AI? Are there broad implications or concerns we should be thinking about? Let me start with you, Shane.
Ideally, it doesn't work for the economy of scale where most of these technologies really work at their best. But even more specifically, and I'm glad that Jennifer brought this up, in the privacy arena is you need to have that balance of, to have really good privacy, you need to have security. And as we know, and we have a very large government that has lots of resources, we don't do it well. And so when you go to some of these smaller countries, they really don't emphasize either privacy or security. And so when they talk about data localization, a lot of times they are just a cesspool of opportunity for cyber criminals, is what I most worry about. It's not that the idea isn't laudable, it's that the implementation tends to fail.
Okay. So you're concerned primarily around security issues, Ken?
So I want to come back to your point about sovereignty. Sovereignty, particularly in the transatlantic setting, has been a reactive concept, where European governments that have not managed to invest successfully in cloud infrastructure and all the other components of successful AI are trying to create autonomous capacities. So it's by design industrial policy. It also goes under the name of competitiveness these days, which is part of the title of this entire event. So what you've seen is a coming together of concerns about sovereignty and concerns about competitiveness.
Okay. Karen?
Yeah, I'm just going to say what everybody's saying, but in a different way.
All right.
I think it's understandable that countries have these concerns when so often the platforms that are providing access to the internet are American, they're large, they're opaque, and countries do want to protect their own businesses, culture, civil liberties, and so on. Sometimes more oppressive countries want to protect what people see and hear. But the answer, obviously, is to do the kinds of things Shane was talking about and Ken were talking about, which is to do capacity building, the kind of capacity building that the US government does, but that also various international institutions do to help folks protect the things they really want to protect and help them invest in being able to take advantage of the opportunities of this global common good, the internet and data.
Yeah, Alice.
I want to make 3 points on this, I think, that we haven't quite touched on yet. And I actually want to start with the point that Jennifer made with the Nigeria example, which I thought was fantastic. And I wrote down while she was talking, so interesting about that anecdote is that Nigeria is trying to keep its data in, but in doing so, it keeps everyone else's data out. And that's incredibly important for model innovation, because we all know AI model training takes an enormous amount of data. And if your models are going to be good, you need global data. You need data from all over the world, from every possible conceivable use case, to increase their performance and their capabilities, right? And so the idea of data localization means that that job gets much, much harder. And it's harder for the countries themselves that are making this requirement. It's not just that they are encircling themselves in a way that allows them to innovate differently from everyone else, which I think is part of the concept. It's actually going to engineer the opposite outcome. And I think that's a really important thing for us to keep in mind as we talk about these really legitimate goals. I think privacy is a very legitimate goal, right? It's something we have to take seriously. National security, of course, dictates that there's certain information that has different security requirements. Which leads me to my second point, which is about cybersecurity, which gets worse when you do this data localization requirement because it doesn't allow you to do that centrally managed cybersecurity practice that we at Google absolutely take that approach to, right? So in fact, data localization makes it harder for us to have the best cybersecurity in the world. And then finally, I want to recognize that this is a very complicated issue. We have a cloud business that recognizes there's a high demand for data sovereignty. And so in a practical sense, we're trying to figure out how to advocate around the world with governments that in general, data localization is just not helpful. It's not actually good for the ecosystem. It's not good for your innovation prospects. It's not good for your local businesses. But we understand there's a demand for it, and we're going to try and be able to meet those needs as well through our sovereign cloud. So I just want to end on there's kind of no absolute answer here. There are good principles to follow, and then there's the practicalities that we all have to work with.
Right, and we're going to dive into some of these topics now in more detail. So thanks for that initial round. And if other people want to comment on Jennifer's, anything that she had to say, that would be great. Picking up on something she did say, was she talked about governments using this technology to surveil, censor, and repress. So I wanted to turn to Karen Given your focus on some of these issues over your career, what is your take on this? To what extent could digital sovereignty be used to an extreme to exercise control over the technology and to use it to censor, surveil, and repress?
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to take us back for a second to the early part of the century when many of us were enamored of what were called then the Twitter revolutions in the Middle East, where we had this understanding that the internet could empower individuals to rise up against authoritarians, and that was, very exciting. But what happened thereafter was that some of these authoritarian governments also figured out how to use these tools, and they use them to sort of crowd out the private sphere by censoring media, censoring other information they didn't want people to get, throwing out a lot of propaganda, and also giving people a sense that they were being watched, which often they were, and that they would be punished for having any aberrant, ideas. And I think that, as we've been talking about, the impulse for some is to cut off access, and that's absolutely not the right answer. I was chairman of the board of Radio Free Europe and the Open Technology Fund, which are two nonprofits funded by the U.S. government, and what they're about is giving people abroad living under authoritarian governments, under repressive governments, access to information or tools by which they can get access to information that they want and need. And this is incredibly powerful. They wouldn't be able to get it if there was limited access to the internet and to data. In fact, one of the main ways that people get access to Radio Free Europe was through YouTube. And for that was one of the reasons I believe that Russia cut off access to YouTube recently. They don't like that access. So I think that the answer to dealing with this digital authoritarianism is access, but it's also, as we've all been saying, and I sound like a broken record, but privacy, security, and protection of other civil liberties. And that's not so easy. Like, we can't just list it. And I think we've been talking about how we get there.
Yeah, it's super hard to strike that balance, because on the one hand, you want to perhaps restrict data from going. You don't want to help authoritarian regimes become more authoritarian and use these tools in a way that disadvantages their citizens and other people around the world. On the other hand, giving them access, giving their people access to the information can be a counter to this. And we've seen this sort of battle of legal norms play itself out. I think, Ken, you're the most intimately familiar with this as it relates to Europe and the US. So in our transatlantic conversation, this idea of digital sovereignty, I think when we both first started talking about these issues, was viewed as almost perhaps hinted of economic protectionism in Europe as a way of favoring domestic companies and maybe disadvantaging the big dominant US companies that were trying to do business in Europe. And there's been a lot of transatlantic tension relating to privacy norms and whether our privacy laws and our national security laws meet EU standards. So Ken, I was curious, what is your current thinking on the state of that transatlantic conversation as impacted by AI? How has AI changed things in your view?
Well, the first point is that the U.S. and the European Union, after a lot of hard work, have a data transfer agreement in place. So there's currently a stable environment for data to flow freely across the ocean. And however, that agreement is in some danger from both directions. First, from the European Union, there's a judicial challenge that's pending to it before the European Court of Justice that will be decided later this year. And it is entirely possible that that court will once again rule that the privacy standards in the U.S. don't measure up to the fundamental rights norms of Europe. It's also under some danger in the United States, notably from decisions by the Trump administration. Another microphone. Okay.
Go for three.
Okay. The Trump administration in early moves removed the leading Democratic officials from the Federal Trade Commission and also from the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. These are organizations that are important in the European way of thinking because they provide independent oversight and redress to the activities of the U.S. national security agencies where Alex used to work. That may or may not be the end of what the Trump administration does to privacy oversight boards. There's a surveillance oversight court established in the Justice Department pursuant to agreement with the EU that remains in place, but potentially there could also be some targeting of that organization. So what happens if the data transfer agreement between the US and the European Union falls? We are then in a period of great uncertainty. Businesses obviously need to continue to transfer data across the ocean. There could well be another attempt by governments to negotiate a framework for that. But I don't think one can assume in the current political environment that there will necessarily be a successor to the current agreement. So what we have, this is the transatlantic situation, but what we have more broadly, Jennifer alluded to it, is sort of an ad hoc architecture for data flows across the world. The U.S. is pushing for the global cross-border data framework, which is valued in Asia. The Europeans are not enamored of this framework. So mostly what happens is the data flows pursuant to contractual arrangements. And those contractual arrangements carry with them privacy safeguards which may or may not be sufficient. It's not a perfect system. One can imagine a different architecture, but we're not there currently.
So I just want to stay with you a little bit longer on the EU. One of the things that we've seen recently with the AI conversation, actually throw it open to everybody who wants to come in on this, and we heard Jennifer emphasize the importance of innovation. So one of the developments that we've seen in the EU in particular has been this move towards simplification. In the UK, they've called for, they have their own AI action plan where they're looking for measures to help encourage homegrown AI. They're doing this. The US, of course, has its own call for an AI action plan as well. Do we see this recognition that innovation is important as a way through some of these traditional data localization measures or not? What do you see in Europe, Ken, on that?
I would say potentially. There has certainly been a change in rhetoric. In Europe, there was a big impact from a study that was done by a former president of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, which pointed to Europe's flagging competitiveness, particularly in technology areas like AI. And that has prompted initiatives to review existing legislation to see if the regulatory burdens can be lowered. So the vocabulary now is of simplification. Remember, though, that these are laws that the EU has just put in place in the last 5 to 10 years. The GDPR, more recently the AI Act, and legislation that also addresses non-personal data. So there's a substantial edifice of law. I don't think it's likely that they will be backing away from that body of law in the short term. They are at the point of figuring out the interactions between these legal measures. How does the AI Act interact with the GDPR, for example? Lots of questions that are important there. So that is the nature of the dialogue that's going on in Europe.
Yeah, go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, the only other things I'll add is that one of the talking points, at least on the simplification, is to make it easier for small and medium enterprises because the governance requirements are so extensive. So I think that's really interesting. But we have also seen, like in this code of practice that's the last draft that would sort of take the place of the AI Act until it's fully implemented, that there was a step away from dealing with some of the near-term concerns about AI in favor of like really monitoring mostly just the existential risks, as we call them, which is unfortunate. It would be, I mean, the big elephants in the room for European competitiveness are that they don't have deep capital markets and a single market, and that involves so much work in terms of regulatory harmonization. And it would be a shame to focus on, lowering the ceiling in terms of some of these near-term civil liberties risks, and instead of the things that would have a huge impact.
Alice, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think what's so interesting about the simplification debate is I think it is one part of the EU and the EC responding to genuine concerns amongst Europeans and amongst member states about having the capacity to innovate and adopt AI, and recognizing that the regulatory environment has become so complex that it's very challenging, especially to small businesses. But frankly, it's even challenging to us. And I think that's sort of one strain of thinking. And then at the same time, we have this strain, like in the Code of Practice, that has actually added complexity. So the Code of Practice is supposed to be an assist that explains how to implement the AI Act. And at least in the first couple of versions, there were additional requirements that weren't actually found in the original text put into the COP. And so the complexity just continues to mount, and the documents just get more and more detailed, as opposed to being a true clarification process and a true process of streamlining how will you implement this. And so you can just see, EU battling for its soul right now over how are we going to set up a regulatory environment that is true to their aspirations, I think, a predictable one in which to operate businesses. And they're just frankly struggling through that. And I think for us, figuring out how are we going to navigate this environment looks very uncertain because of those dynamics.
Yeah, I do want to come back to you on that, but let me bring Shane into the conversation. Do you have, I know you've also been looking at some of these developments in the EU. Do you have views?
So they love to regulate on input rather than outcome, which is a problem, because they think they see a problem, and rather than trying to go for a solution or work the companies or the entity in that can help them with the solution, they come out with this mandate. And then when you try to explain them that the outcome that they want is not going to be created by the input, the regulation that they've put together, I've had several people from the European Commission tell me, it is the law, you just must comply. And you're like, well, but the law doesn't get you to where you want to head. So can't we stop for a minute, AI Act included, and say, what is it you're trying to get accomplished here? Let's kind of rework these solution sets. And they're like, no, it's the law. And I'm like, oh, you did the hard part. You went to a meeting. Oh, well, we don't want to get in the way of your words and actually get to a solution here. And I was just in a meeting with 3 European parliamentarians this morning, who one of them said, Americans just love talking about that Draghi report, much more than I think we've actually read it. So, but then I responded back that it's sort of like a friend who's in a marriage that's in counseling. They still can't see the problem. All you do is go to dinner. You know what the problem is. Yeah. And it is the markets. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of us in this room who've been told these people, you got friends who hate the Trump administration. They're all going to move to Europe. All these Europeans are not coming to the United States because they don't want to come to the United States because we're evildoers now. And you're like, great, stay in Europe. Good luck getting capital. Flights leave every day. Good luck. And they just sort of look at you like, oh, that you're just like, took all the fun out of that right there. So I think that we still have a reckoning on how this all goes. Obviously, Alice lives this more than a lot of us on a real daily basis of these huge fines the Europeans are putting on American companies that are succeeding because they have done the homework, they have done the R&D, they have done things that people like, they have been able to be successful. We love competition. We would love to be competing with somebody other than the Chinese. So let's see what we can do to help Europe help themselves. Maybe if we print out a bunch of the Draghi reports, they might actually read it.
One thing that Europe has also taken a lead on is data localization and sovereign cloud infrastructure and those kinds of requirements, which are undertaken with a cybersecurity justification. And I know you've done some thinking on this, Shane. Can you talk about that? Or is that a valid justification? Are things going to be more secure if we can make sure that the data is processed in data centers that are subject to the standards that a country wants to impose? and that data is not removed from the country unless certain requirements are met. Is that the way to get at cybersecurity? Or what are your thoughts on that?
I think a lot of countries that are looking at data localization and using sovereignty as the reason to get there are, again, I mentioned this early on, they're imbalanced in their actual process of doing that. So they're not actually looking at how they're going to put their IT systems in place with their society to match the security and the privacy expectations. A lot of times they want to go local. They don't actually have the capacity, sometimes don't even have the power capacity to do it at a level that they'd have to do it. They'd be better off to do it in a regional process. Maybe you do it in Singapore for a lot of the Asian entities. And, but they really think that, well, the data has to stay local. And what they do then is they omit themselves from different things about artificial intelligence. They no longer become part of the data sets of how we progress and how we're designing the learning language models, which is a real challenge for places that are not English native speaking or Roman character entities. And so they haven't really thought through how they're cabining themselves off to a potential future on this, besides the fact that they are also risking their security and potentially their privacy.
What do you think about that, Alice? And you're of course at Google. I'm going to ask you to represent the entire tech sector of the United States. Like how we have these claims for localizing data because it helps domestic industry. We don't want to be quote unquote digitally colonized by companies overseas. We want to derive the value of the data for ourselves. Cybersecurity, privacy protection. How does a company like Google navigate through all of that and still develop the AI and try to maintain leadership against global competition?
Yeah, I mean, I alluded to the fact that our challenge is, we think, to develop cutting-edge AI models, to innovate around AI, to build innovative products on top of AI models. You cannot fragment the internet, and you cannot fragment your data in that way. Because it will really dramatically slow you down. And if we're in an environment where everyone is incentivized to be using and building the most state-of-the-art possible systems, disadvantaging yourself in that way is just cutting your nose off to spite your face. I think the other thing we emphasize is that our own infrastructure is built to be performant, available, reliable, secure, redundant, and that looks like operating a global infrastructure footprint. And we think we deliver really well on privacy and security for our customers, and so that's what we try to explain to governments about the cybersecurity that is actually possible that way. Now, separate from that, a lot of the sovereign debates, especially sovereign cloud debates, are also about national security customers. And I think sometimes those two things get conflated. And coming out of the national security community, I understand the requirement for a secure, air-gapped, classified environment. But that is different. That is a different kind of information. And that is a different kind of information management than what we're talking about in a commercial sense, right? So I think that's another thing that's really important to always ask whenever you're talking to somebody about data sovereignty. It's like, well, are you talking about your sovereign national security interests? Or are you talking about your concerns about privacy and security generally for consumers? Because if that's what you're worried about, then there are a lot of ways to meet your privacy and security requirements that don't require data localization, and let's work on that together. And like I said, we operate a cloud business. If there's a high demand among customers to meet data localization requirements, we are going to do everything we can to meet them where they're at. But in a principled, practical perspective, we are constantly encouraging folks to not think about data localization as solving those security and privacy problems.
And recognizing that you're coming at this from the perspective now of being at Google, but do you feel like it's possible to develop an AI competitor that does not have access to global data for training or other purposes? I mean, is that even a
At the
possibility?
scale of data you need for state-of-the-art, I can't imagine it, quite honestly.
So, Karen, you've thought about, I mean, we've had conversations before where you're thinking about how do we do governance and how do different countries do governance? The EU has taken a particular approach with the AI Act. The US is, at the moment, that we don't have comprehensive privacy legislation. We're still thinking things through in terms of how that's going to develop. And other countries, as we've heard, have their own maybe versions of GDPR. Who knows if they're going to copy the AI Act as well? What are your thoughts on how do we bridge all of those differences?
Yeah, I mean, we're in the early days on AI, and we've had fits and starts. We've had the AI safety summits. The G7 has launched this Hiroshima AI process, and the OECD has been charged with being the repository for the company reports. A large number, I think it's 19 companies actually reported. It was really interesting to see if they would take it seriously, and they did. So that's interesting. What they're reporting there is things like their governance and their transparency and their mitigation efforts and their stakeholder engagement and so on. And there's more or less detail in that, but it's interesting that seems to have, at least started. And I think what's going to be interesting is, are we going to have some kind of interoperable AI governance architecture, I'd like to call it, where we have some things like the OECD process where people are reporting, and we'll have, we have the European AI Act, and then different countries have their domestic laws, and they figure out how to interoperate among those. But I think we're still in early days, but it's hopeful at least that the companies participated and filed reports. CDT, we're looking at those now. We're analyzing them and figuring out what kind of feedback. Because obviously, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, did it really fall? So somebody has to be reading these things, interpreting them, giving feedback, and so on. So that's a real role for civil society. But obviously, there's a big role for companies and for governments, both at the multilateral level and domestically.
Does anyone else have a comment on the international norms and how we align different governance approaches so that AI? So I guess this is a question I've asked my students to do work on. I've given one of them the assignment of comparing the AI principles that are currently articulated in various instruments, including the OECD AI principles. There's also obviously the EU AI Act. There's the Council of Europe Convention on Framework for Artificial Intelligence, and the Office of Management and Budget in the White House. If you haven't read that, you should. There's a memo on government agency use of AI, which I think is very good, and talks about the principles required for trustworthy AI adoption by federal government agencies. Are there more similarities than differences? Can we find a way to bridge any gaps between countries, or are we really in a race where everyone is interested in advancing the interest of their AI and tech companies and not truly interested in reaching sort of an international consensus? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to underestimate the efforts that Karen and others led in the last administration to try to build international frameworks on AI. But we all heard Jennifer say in her remarks that the U.S. is aiming for AI dominance. And that is also the goal of other countries in the world. And that is going to create tension in these efforts to make international frameworks work. The U.S. not only does not have a national AI law, but it's entirely possible that the Congress may prevent states from stepping in with their own AI laws. So the U.S. will be, at least in the short term, in a much less regulated environment than Europe, for example, or any of the other countries in the world that are adopting AI laws. So I don't want to underestimate the challenge that we will face at the international level.
This is on the boring side, but compliance is important. And I think what we have done a lot in the United States, where we look at people think we don't have privacy laws here. That's not true. We have healthcare privacy. We have, certain industries that roll through things that we have banking, absolutely. So you have a similar situation with compliance. A lot of these, especially larger companies, just want to know what the rules to the road are. They don't want to be over-regulated, but they want to know guidance. So if we can do a risk assessment that gives them industry norms and protocols that they can then measure against, and they actually want to know at a certain level what the others are up to, just to make sure that they're not doing things that are outside the guardrails, but they don't necessarily want governments telling them how to do their business. So I do think there's some compliance mechanisms that we might see come in place that will be maybe soft governance faster than be done by the industry than we do have full government regulation, which I'd be for with that.
Yeah, and just to build on that, you know, when we talk about laws, there are a lot of existing laws on consumer protection, on civil rights, on civil liberties, and even at the international level on money laundering, on proliferation, and so on. So I think part of this AI architecture has to be figuring out how to make sure that when you're using AI, when you're building AI, it's in compliance with these, and that means really modernizing these instruments and the institutions that enforce them. And I think there's so much cynicism about that because government, in many ways, is just not kept up with the speed of technology and innovation. But we have to do the hard work and sort of roll up our sleeves and figure out how to make that work. I don't think everything has to be invented anew for AI. There are obviously some brand new challenges with AI, and we have to deal with them in a focused way. But some of this can be dealt with on just existing both domestic and international laws.
Can I just say, when the ambassador was first talking, it was reminding me about just the importance of international standards and the standardization process, which is, I think, you know, one of the international sets of institutions that still works quite well.
Yeah.
And which those of us in industry really rely on because there's, you know, regulatory interoperability. And then there's also just technological interoperability, which is also really important. And so I think the more we can let the standards process actually mature, the better off we'll be. And the challenge I think that we face is that there's a lot of desire both to regulate quickly so as not to lose the opportunity, and also to regulate the underlying technology itself, because I think that feels like a panacea to a lot of folks. I think, Shane, you were talking earlier about trying to regulate for inputs instead of outcomes. And what always strikes me is that there's an awful lot of regulation that applies to AI. One of the things we often say is if it's illegal without AI, it's still illegal with AI. And so what's really important is for us to take a step back and say, well, okay, if you have anti-discrimination laws in your state, why do you think they don't apply when AI is involved? And where do you think the gap is? And let's do that analysis first. And then if we need an AI-specific law, then let's go about it after having first done that homework. But I think there's a real sense of urgency in the system because the technology is developing so quickly. But in part, that's why we're still trying to get to the standard eval sets for performance and safety. And we have to build that science and that empirical basis to make good policy. And I think that's a lot of the tension you hear in these debates.
Yeah, and it's a very difficult problem because technology is moving so fast, as you point out, and government regulatory processes, other than in the EU, move so slowly that there's a real concern, and there's additional pressure, of course, in the AI world. Not only is it a race, or it's perceived to be a race, which, you know, with technology changing so quickly, the leadership could change quickly, and then that might have enormous, at least the perception is, enormous geopolitical sort of economic security and national security consequences. So I was wondering if we could pivot a little bit to talk about China. And obviously the US government has recognized a risk to US national security from actions by the People's Republic of China to obtain data about Americans and to use technology or control technology that Americans use in order to further the Chinese government's ends. And there's also a lot of talk in this conference about how the government can use AI for its own defense and national security purposes. So I just wanted to ask you all to pause a bit and talk about how do you see what's happening from a national security threat perspective and how the US is responding and how companies are, again, caught in the middle because you are essentially the battleground over which this is being fought. Go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, Jennifer referred to the fact that the US has a general predisposition towards open data flows, but also essentially export controls on data transfers to certain countries of concern. In Europe, interestingly, which has long had a much more conditional approach to data transfers, the focus for a long time was on data transfers to the United States and the risk that agencies like the NSA would have access to them. No concern for a decade expressed about data transfers to China. That has just begun to change. There was an important decision about a month ago from the Irish Data Protection Commissioner. It was found that TikTok's data transfers to China were not compliant with European data protection standards. And they specifically alluded to the fact that the Chinese government could have access to this data under a variety of national security laws. And a large fine was imposed on TikTok. And that has opened the door. There are now a number of other cases pending that involve data transfers in the consumer context to other Chinese companies. So that is, I think, a recognition of geopolitical reality that has started to take root in the European Union. It's not just this singular focus on the United States. So that's an additional complication that Europe faces for the data transfer environment.
Great. Anybody else?
Going back to your China question, I think about DeepSeek, and I feel like people just don't say it out loud, that this was just another situation where China did an IP ripoff of our data and trained it, and what they got really focused on was the development cost. And then even if you dial that back, you see that most of the cost of the design was done specifically to create a venture capital firm. Then they built on top of that. So it's a phenomenon. What it did psychologically is tell us that maybe you can use like kind of pre-designed data to build on, and it'd be less expensive than having to start from the beginning. But I don't think is as big of a phenomenon as it felt like in January. Now that we've had time to kind of digest exactly what happened.
Great. We only have a couple minutes left.
I have an EU question, if I might.
Well, we just only have a couple minutes left. Let me just, I was going to ask them for one, because we have another two people coming up and talking. Could you, if you had one piece of advice for the U.S. government to help sort through all of these issues, what would that piece of advice be? Or what would you ask them to focus on?
I would ask them not to get in the way of progress and innovation.
Okay.
Go ahead, I'm still thinking.
Yeah, regulate outputs, not inputs, and really invest in international standardization. And let us get to those standards and then adopt those standards.
Yeah, again, I guess I mean, we can't eat our seed corn. We have to keep investing in science and research, and if we want to make it focused on competitiveness and AI dominance, we can take the ARPA model, or we can take ARPA itself, and focus it. I don't think I think it's interesting the use of the term AI dominance, but the use of the export controls and so on to ensure that to get to your previous question about China, that the U.S. wins in terms of national security, but also in terms of our values, is really important.
And I would say don't lose sight of the importance of data flows internationally and continuing to build an architecture that works for that.
Great. Now, we will be available for questions after the panel, but we just have to keep moving because there's another people coming up right after us. So please join me in thanking the panel.